We at Story Strategist are helping organisations embrace new technologies and tell more engaging stories. I've had the privilege of leading teams for some of the world's most innovative companies, enabling media technology. This includes the Connect 20 Online Media and Art Summit. We've responded rapidly to an opportunity to represent an online summit when a conference was not possible. If you'd like help building an appropriate media solution, then I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for joining us for the Connect 20 Online Summit. I'm Mel Wade, and joining me is my old mate Luke Weston.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Well, another one for the film buffs today as we join Stu Harris of Story Strategist, who's in conversation with Rich Peluso from Affirm Films, a division of Sony. Rich is an instrumental voice in Christian media and has been Executive Vice President of Affirm since 2007. Stu will be discussing the increasing success of the Christian film industry and how the next generation of filmmakers can be positioned for greater impact in the days ahead.
Thanks to Excelsior College, here's Stu Harris and Rich Peluso.
Welcome, Rich Peluso, and thank you so much for joining this, our Connect 20 Online Media and Art Summit. It's really great, an honor to have you here with us on the call. Now, you live in Tennessee, obviously the United States, not far from, just been doing my research on Google, see that you're not far from Franklin, which is somewhat close to Nashville. I've been to Franklin, I think it's like a 40-minute drive or something from there, and it's...
I guess if you were driving in traffic, yes, it okay. Should only be about 20 minutes. But
but it looks like a charming, beautiful kind of rural setting there. I'd just love to hear firstly, what do things look like for you living in the States right now as the US starts to relax restrictions? How does that look for you? Give us some context.
Sure. Well, Tennessee actually opened up a couple weeks ago, and so we have. We are released from our domestic prisons, and we are freed to wander. And so I've actually started having outside meetings again. Had a meeting with a producer at a pub and had a few pints, and had breakfast with a writer. And so we're kind of getting back to normal. But I live here, but my office and my staff are in Los Angeles, and I commute there about a week a month. And so that's been difficult because California, on the other hand, is very much still under lockdown and will be probably at least until early or mid-July, if not beyond. But I live in a horse farm community, which is outside of Franklin, very, very rural. I have one neighbor I can see. We have lots of land. So even in the heart of the lockdown, we could go hiking and walking out to a river and be outside. And so I count myself blessed and fortunate to not have really felt kind of locked into a small space.
And I should also, of course, mention that you are, in your professional capacity, you're Executive Vice President for Affirm Films and Affirm Television, which is a division of Sony Pictures Entertainment. And you mentioned there that they're based obviously in Culver City, Los Angeles, and you're there in Tennessee. Obviously, it's a bit of a flight away. I'm guessing you're no stranger to video conferencing apps then and working remotely.
No, because like I said, I commute there once a month for a week. So the rest of the time, I'm either working here in Nashville or I'm on a film production, and so that. I'm still managing a staff and multiple projects that we're developing and evaluating. And so yeah, we do the teleconference, video conference thing for many, many years. And so yeah, we're not strangers to that, to working remotely at all.
Yeah, that's good. So before joining the Affirm Film and Sony Pictures back in 2007, I understand, you were in the music business working for EMI. So how did you transition into the film industry? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the music business. I started as a sales and marketing representative. So my job really was, I think I was 23 or 24 years old, and my job was to manage a small territory of the U.S., a part of the Northeast. And I would go out, I would leave my home on Monday morning at 5 a.m. and I would get home Friday night. And so, hotels all during the week, and I'm visiting every Christian bookstore, mainstream record store, and Christian radio station and promoter in my territory. And I'm talking up the newest releases, sharing music with people, trying to get radio stations to play a song so that the retail stores would carry the song and the promoter would book the artist to come perform the song. It's all symbiotic in many ways. Or symbiotic is a little too generous. It's more a horrible catch-22. But several years doing that, and then moved up to run the sales organization, and then shortly after that became president of EMI Christian Music Group. Worked on signing and developing artists like Switchfoot and Toby Mac and Chris Tomlin, and just a lot of incredible artists. So I was in music for 15 years, and it was a couple things changed for me. One was I have 4 daughters, and I noticed how immersed they were in visual entertainment, the Disney Channel and Nickelodeon. And I always wanted my work to be relevant to my kids. And I grew up, I could buy an LP, an album, and I could sit and listen to it 30 times in a row and pour through the liner notes and think about the artist. And my kids and their generation, music was simply a soundtrack to your life. It's what you listened to while you were doing something else, and visual entertainment was really what was important to them. So that was a spark for me. And then one of the artists that we developed was a little teen group called Jump 5, and we invested a lot in some great music videos, they were so good, and the artist made such an impact. They ended up performing at Disney. They did the Beauty and the Beast for the Beauty and the Beast DVD release and the movie release. They did a cover of the song, and so I really started to want to get more into visual entertainment. And so one of the last things I did when I was in music was I signed a distribution deal for a kids video company, and that was created by a woman named Julie Clark. And Julie Clark created the brand Baby Einstein. I don't know if that's known in Australia, but Baby Einstein is a huge kids brand. And she created that in her home and sold that company to Disney. And she started a new company. And I signed a distribution deal with her when I was at EMI. And in relationship with her and her husband, I kind of fell in love with their mission. And then they brought me out of EMI to run their new company, which was called the Safe Side Company. And we were creating live action kind of short movies for kids about personal safety. And we sold that company to Sony. Sony had a kids division called Sony Wonder. And the executive that I did the deal with at Sony, Wonder, shortly after, when we sold that to Sony, I wanted to take a couple of years off. And I just wanted to, I'd been in a corporate environment for so long. And so what happened was that the guy we did the deal with ended up going to Sony Pictures and becoming the vice president of family entertainment. And right about that time, this little church-made movie called Facing the Giants was acquired by Sony Pictures, and it unexpectedly blew up in theaters. And Sony went to this same executive and said, "We don't really understand why this movie did so well, but we want you to figure it out. And we want to do more of this." And so this executive called me. This is about 6 months after we did the deal, and I was just kind of at home helping a few friends with their businesses, and I was managing a musical act. And he called and said, "Listen, Sony wants us to get into the business of faith-based film." He said, "But the problem is that I'm Jewish and everyone I work with are Jewish. We don't understand anything about this." And he said, "You're the only Christian I know." So as a friend, I flew out to LA to spend a day with him. I laid out a business plan and some ideas on what Sony could do to start a faith-based division. My goal was to present it to him as a friend and give it to him to equip him to go do this. When I arrived in LA, he told me that he had told a few other people that I was coming in, and he asked if I wouldn't mind sharing my ideas with a group. And so I said, sure. And we went upstairs, and there was actually an entire conference room filled with people, including the president of Sony Pictures Worldwide. And I was in a t-shirt and jeans, a t-shirt and shorts, because Steve and I were just supposed to be hanging out as friends. So I walk in this conference room looking like an idiot. And I give this presentation that was meant for just Steve. So it was very sarcastic and snarky about how bad Sony was at family entertainment. And if they wanted to get into this space, they had to make some real solid, big decisions and invest in some real change to do this. And so I had no idea the audience I was about to give. And so I give the presentation to. And when I finished the presentation, there were a lot of great questions. I left the meeting. Steve and I hung out. I flew home the next morning. And that day when I landed in Tennessee, Steve called me and said, Sony wants to hire you to do this and launch this film studio.
Wow.
So that's how I got the gig. I wasn't looking for it. I really had no interest. I actually said no. I turned it down. But then I helped consult them to help Steve and his team build this for Sony. And the very first project that we worked on was even more successful than the previous. And so Sony gave me the opportunity to run the division, but be able to stay in Nashville. And so that kind of cemented it for me. So that's how I ended up. It was it was totally a God thing. I would not have given, if I would have known that I was going to give the presentation to the group of people that was in that room, it would have been a completely different kind of presentation, and it probably would have completely flopped. Wow. What it turned out to be was hard hitting and honest and open and direct and sarcastic in many ways to make points. And I think that's what kind of shocked the room and had them think that I was a much bolder person than I really am.
Wow, that's incredible. Really a classic kind of situation of being in the right place at the right time, possibly wearing the wrong pants, right. but but certainly the right guy for the job. And I know many of us would be thankful for what you've managed to achieve at Sony and with Affirm Pictures. It's quite remarkable, the portfolio of films that you've been involved in since then. It would be great just for those that maybe aren't familiar with the process, just to understand just for a snippet, if you like, of what that process looks like. It sounds to me like you pretty much wrote the job description, if you like.
Right.
However, if you could just give us a little insight of what it means to be an executive vice president and how you would, what the process looks like, and how do you find good stories? I guess that's the real heart of the question is how do you find good stories?
Well, there's a lot inside of your question, and I'll try to parse it out and move through it pretty quickly. So originally, when we started Affirm Films, the success we had was with an independently produced low budget film. And so the natural thought in the thought process is, hey, let's go find more of those. And what we learned very quickly was that there weren't really more of those that were of that quality of storytelling. And when you look back at that movie, Facing the Giants, it's not that I would say it's Academy Award level production. It was just, it was a great story and great writing. It was compelling and it gathered an audience. And so we quickly realized there weren't trees of low-hanging fruit in a field of all these independently made films we could just acquire and put into theaters. And so we had to quickly pivot, and we had to figure out how do we bring about the resources to make those films get made. Okay, how do we help them? So it's, hey, let's go back to these same filmmakers and resource and equip them to make bigger, better films which we did with Fireproof and Courageous and War Room. How do we go out and find other emerging, aspiring, faith-based filmmakers that have great stories or IP but need resources? And then how do we go after more established filmmakers that have some sort of preference or interest in telling stories of faith? So that would be, talking to people like Randall Wallace, who wrote Braveheart and then directed, Heaven is for Real, and going and finding these producers and directors that are more established, and giving them the opportunity to tell meaningful stories in the faith environment. And so that was kind of our evolution, our quick evolution over the last 8 years. And then in terms of how we operate now, we're constantly looking for the best stories that we can find. We're Sony Pictures, so funding is not an issue. We're really constrained by two things. One is the quality of great IP and writing, okay? And the second one is the incredibly brutal, competitive landscape in the theatrical marketing space, in the theatrical release space. Disney's acquisition of Marvel and Fox and everything they've done has completely changed the landscape. You used to have these pockets and windows in a release schedule that you could compete in with, kind of character-driven dramas and modest budgeted films. But what's happened now is, first off, Disney's the first to the table, and they're like, well, I've got to put my Star Wars here and my Marvels here, and I've got to put and once they do that, and then, Warner comes in and big Sony comes in, it's incredibly competitive. And so those are the big two constraining factors. And then to finally answer your question of, what do I do? What do we do day to day to progress this and make these films is, I personally have hundreds, probably 300 Google alerts set up. So I spend a good chunk of my morning poring through what the nets have pulled in terms of keywords for meaningful, inspirational stories, life-changing. I have all these keywords, and I pull in things and review that. Doing the things that a lot of people do, which is, here in the States, watch CBS Sunday Morning and 60 Minutes and looking for these news stories, consuming news and human interest stories, and then reading books and getting close to the publishers of these inspirational stories to hear about these before they're published. When a book is published and it starts to sell well, that's not the best time to get the rights. The best time to get the right, because everyone's coming in and they're going to be bidding for it. And so it's finding these stories early on. And so we spend a lot of time doing that. Alternatively, we also have a lot of producers and directors that are doing the same thing, that are pitching us things they've found. And so in any 1 week, we're looking at 10 to 20 pitches that come in. We have a tracking list of about 200 projects we're looking at, and any 1 week, 10 to 20 fall off. And that's week after week, all in the hopes of finding one thing to make this year. So, that's our process.
That's wonderful. And it's fair to say that, we've seen such an increase of great quality films over this past 10, 15 years, let's say, including some of the films that you've mentioned, War Room, Soul Surfer, Risen, beautiful film. The Star, my kids just love that. We were just talking about that. And Overcomer, of course, you've mentioned as well. There's a longer list, but the question I have is, are more Christians visiting theaters, or is it that people are more generally open to the themes of faith-based films? What have we seen that's changed?
Well, of course, my response is pre-COVID, kind of the world as we knew it. So we do a lot of research, and what we found is that, that the community of believers in the United States generally are not frequent moviegoers. They might see 3 or 4 films a year. They tend to be looking for films that are meaningful and have depth to them. So it doesn't have to be a faith-based film. They can see something like Hacksaw Ridge, which actually was very faith-based, but and they go see Star Wars, and they go see big films like everybody else. But when you provide a film that speaks to their faith or their faith journey, something that builds them up or edifies them, or something that they see, especially if the filmmaking is high quality and you have known talent, actors that are delivering great performances. Christians view those things as almost like validating their faith in the popular culture, and they kind of reach out and pull people in to see it. Friends maybe that aren't churched, and that's where we see a lot of crossover. That's why something like Arisen with a Joseph Fiennes, Academy Award-winning actor, or Soul Surfer with a Academy Award-winning actress Helen Hunt and Dennis Quaid, and those things excite and energize a faith audience because it's like a win-win for them. It's a story that glorifies God and relates to their faith, but something that can stand alone as a broad inspirational film that they feel proud in some way to get other people in to see. So we look for those really broad.
Yeah, I was just going to say, perhaps the word is also confidence. There's a confidence that there are films that stand on their own, or stand alongside, if you like, other films that are being made in the industry too. So we can be confident to take our friends along, or to talk about those kinds of films at the water cooler.
Yeah, I might still have a little bit of cheese in it, but the cheese is going to be finely aged cheese. It's the same level that you might find in like the movie Wonder. I don't know if you saw the movie Wonder.
I did. It's
or
lovely.
if your kids saw it. It's
Yeah.
a lovely film, but you know what? It's got a few eye-rolling moments in there. It's a little over the top, but that's okay because the actors are so good, and they're delivering this movie that impacts your hearts and your minds. And sometimes we're just, I'm going to go along with that little bit of an eye-rolling moment because the whole thing is just so good. And that's something that's a little bit of forgiveness that viewers will give you when you got a great story.
Yes, that's true. That is very true. I just want to pivot for a moment, and there's that word. I promised myself I wouldn't use it anymore, but everyone seems to be. I'm sorry about that. Later today, I'll be interviewing writer-director Stuart Hazeldine, who directed The Shack, and executive producer Eric Loxmo from Aspiration Entertainment. And then later in the week, we'll be speaking with writer-director Brian Bird and writer-producer Jason Paymer. And during the preparation of those interviews, and these interviews, in fact, we've been talking a lot about how obviously COVID-19 has affected production for the film business worldwide. I'd just love to hear your perspective, obviously coming from Sony, such a large studio. Could you share a little of how this pandemic has affected the studios in particular, not necessarily just Sony, but the studio model in the States right now, and then how you've responded, and possibly how you think it might look, what it looks like to restart production or restart the process. If you could speak into that.
Sure. Well, yes. I mean, of course, there's been a big impact. I mean, Sony and really every other studio has had films shut down in the middle of production in a couple situations within a few days of wrapping. Sony had one of their top TV shows called Blacklist get shut down just a couple weeks before the final production of the season finale. And so there's been a lot of scrambling. In that case, in Blacklist, what Sony did was something really creative. they decided to actually animate the last part of the episode. And so the TV show in mid-camera shifts from live action into animation, and the entire episode is done in animation, animating the real life actors with their voice as if you're still watching live action.
Wow.
So they were able to complete production because all the animators could work from home, so everyone is being very smart and careful, and staying in very close contact with each other. I think one of the things that this has caused is it's caused a feeling of camaraderie even between the studios and between producers, and because we're all in it together and we're all trying to figure out, when are we going to turn things back on, and how do we turn them on in such a way that doesn't cause a chaotic environment, because everything is so compressed now. When, I've got a movie that starts shooting in October, but what if a couple of the actors, we're in the middle of shooting something that got shut down and they need to come back. So we got to figure out their schedule. We got to be respectful of productions that didn't get started yet. And then that carries through in the theatrical space. What happens to all these movies that have not released? Yes, some of them are being sold to Apple and some are being sold to Netflix, but many others are being moved later in the year and into early next year. Well, what about all the films that started production that were set to go then? And so the studios need to dance around each other to figure out the release schedule. So I'm personally, in my view, very confident that things will get back to normal. There may be a slightly different kind of normal, but I can speak for myself and say that it's killing me not seeing the inside of a theater and sitting down with some popcorn and watching a great movie. And I'll be there on the day they open. So I think what we're seeing, to answer your question, I think we're seeing a little less cutthroat competition and a little more thoughtful, partnership-based management of how we get this engine up and running for everybody's good.
That's really good. That's encouraging to hear. I guess some of the conversations we've been having as well, and you can imagine from our perspective, we really are only independent filmmakers. So because we're in we're in Australia, not in the US, and the concern, or even some of the things that we're hearing, is that people are like, is this the death of independence? Because we don't have the kind of budgets that organizations like Sony have and Disney and these much larger organizations with much deeper pockets that might be able to weather the storm because of the cash they have. Well, what's your opinion on that?
Independence will never die. They are a necessity. They are, whether we purposely think about it or not, they happen. Okay, so I've seen it too many times. All right, so I grew up in the music business, right? And I remember in 1996, we released, we had a bunch of records on the release schedule that were the kind of records that everyone always buys, Stephen Curtis Chapman and Michael W. Smith. And I remember going to this big Christian music festival, and I went to the main stage where all the big labels had all the big acts. Okay, Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith and Stephen Curtis Chapman. And then over about 1,000 yards to the left was this thing called the Fringe stage. And there were twice as many people at the Fringe stage than there were at the main stage. And I walked over there and I looked at these music acts, Supertones, and it was ska music, and it was these artists and these labels I'd never heard of before. And I went back to my boss and said, we're in big trouble. If we don't figure this out, we're going to be in trouble. And so as a result of that, we bought this little record label out of Seattle called Tooth and Nail Records, and we sold millions of records, right?
Of course you did.
So, and I've seen it in the film space. And so as the major studios, Disney has abandoned live action family films. Okay. Fox 2000, Fox Searchlight is dead. And these studios are moving more and more into $100-200 million tentpole event films, right? And you know what? Every quarter or a couple times a year, someone comes out with the King's Speech, or someone comes out with Slumdog Millionaire, or someone comes out with Silver Linings Playbook. Something that costs $10 million, independently produced, that blows everybody away. And then the major studios realize they've been missing the boat, and they put resources into this space, and then they abandon some other space that some independent comes in and eats their lunch on. So what I love about independents is that they're hungry, they're entrepreneurial, they're aggressive, they counter program because they have to survive. So you don't see independents thinking, hey, how do we make a comic book movie? How do we make a Spider-Man for only $10 million? I mean, they know they can't do it. They're looking for things. So I think independents are often counted out, but they're always going to be around, because even major studios, they can't put their arms around everything that a consumer will want, because we don't know what a consumer will want. And independents sneak in the margin and pop up with a great project that blows everyone away. And so I think they'll be around. I think there's lots of opportunity for independents.
And I know, obviously, just thinking of our audience here, and many of the people watching this will be from Australia and New Zealand, of course. And there's many colleagues of mine who are writers, and we're separated, however, by a huge ocean between where the industry is, if you like, Hollywood, and by default, we're independent filmmakers, as I said. So what kind of advice would you give us who are separated by that large ocean? Should we just pack up our bags and move to the States? Or as I keep hearing many of my colleagues say they're going to, or what would you say? How would you advise somebody in that situation?
Sure. Well, here in the States, a lot of time is spent by the major studios thinking about, knowing that certain films that they produce and release will organically and naturally feel very regional to North America. But they're always looking for things that will translate into other countries and other territories, things that can bridge the cultural gaps, great stories that will reach other places. And I think independent filmmakers need to think the same way. They need to, if they want to live in Australia or New Zealand and they want to stay there, but they want their film to cross the ocean into North America, then look for high concept, deep emotional human dramas that bridge the cultural gap. Comedies are really hard because they tend to be very regionalized. Conflict-driven character dramas can translate. I will tell you that there was a small independent filmmaker in South Africa by the name of Frans Cronje that made a low-budget little film, very South African, called Faith Like Potatoes.
Yep.
When you stripped away the heavy kind of Afrikaans accent and and some of the cultural things, there was so much that translated so well across the entire faith community worldwide that we saw inside of that little independent film the possibility for something that could work on a bigger scale. And so we acquired the rights and we worked with the filmmaker to actually re-record some of the dialogue to kind of reduce the accent. We recut the film. And, we didn't put it in theaters, but we released it on DVD worldwide. And that, to this day, is one of our top 5 selling movies in our catalog. for a very almost micro budget movie made in South Africa with all South African actors. So it can be done. But it really comes down to an incredible story and great writing, and great performances. And those things they're just not easy, to find the right chemical ingredients to make it work, but it can be done.
So if I can summarize it, it starts with a great story, right? At the core of it, you've got to have a great story.
Absolutely.
Always does.
Yep.
So thinking of this great advice you're giving all of us, of course, if you could sort of go back in time or speak to the younger, so I'll be careful, the younger Rich Peluso, what kind of advice would you have given yourself as you if you were to speak to your younger self?
Wow. Well, that's a very difficult question. For some reason, I'm having a very hard time processing a response. I would have to say this, that there were several big mistakes that I made in decisions on projects to pursue, projects to invest time and resources in, decisions on how we went about doing certain things. And in almost every case, deep down inside in my gut, I knew it was probably a mistake. And I would go back and tell myself, kind of damn the torpedoes. If you believe this is wrong, get out and shut it down and be forceful and be aggressive. And, and don't try to hope things will work out, because a lot of times, when there's a fundamental problem underneath, it's not going to work out. And so I would probably tell myself to be more brave.
Wow, that's good. It sounds like there's in different circumstances, there sounds like a little bit more digging in that response. Yes. That we could go to, possibly the wrong location, wrong context, wrong time of the day, maybe. Certainly for me,
wrong
anyway.
Project, wrong people. There's a lot.
Yeah. No, it reminds me of famous entrepreneur who just said, we need to say no more often to things,
right?
Right. To find the yes. And so I think that sounds very similar. Advice that you would give there as well. Thank you for sharing that. I'd love to hear what you're working on now. I mean, of course, the context is a little bit different to maybe how it would have been 6 months ago, but what kind of things are you working on at the moment?
Well, we tend to keep them under wraps.
I was trying
to keep them under wraps, but
that's a shame. Yeah. I was trying to get a sneaky, glimpse into the future, but anyway, that's okay.
Well, look, we have an incredible sports drama, true life sports drama that we start shooting in October. We're in the middle of casting. We have a great director on board, and I'm working with the same producer. I brought on the same producer that I did Soul Surfer with, and Paul, Apostle of Christ, and When the Game Stands Tall, which is an American football movie we did. We've got very excited. We're doing another, we did this biblical film, Paul, Apostle of Christ, which did incredibly well for us. And we have another biblical story, a female-driven biblical story that we're very excited about, that we are just started the writer. In fact, I just got off the phone with him about a half an hour before we started, congratulating him on getting the writing gig. And, we just started scripting that project that we hope to shoot next year. We've acquired the rights to a phenomenal story from a book that is a true story book about a father and a son that's told over 2 different time periods, 70 years apart, which is a very compelling story that that we're just optioning the book on, so we're about to hire a writer on. And then I've got 2 other projects that are in scripting right now that are in the final stages of development that we hope to produce in the next year. And then in January, we launched a television division, Affirm Television. And we are hard at work. I brought in a television executive. Her name is Mary Beth Sprouse. She was formerly from Hallmark Channel. And we are hard at work developing several TV show concepts to bring out to the networks and start pitching over the next few months. So we're working harder than we ever did when we were in the office.
Lots of work there. So just a final question, really, just to connect to the conference itself, because you may have heard that the theme of this year's conference is Renaissance, which a lot of people think is we think of that in its historical context. But I'd just love to hear what you think, or what the word Renaissance means to you, Rich, and how could this audience sort of take away an encouraging word or a challenge, if you like, from you in regards to what it looks like as we look forward into the new world, the new normal, whatever those cliches are. What would you say to that?
Well, to me, the word and the concept makes me, in my mind, what I go to is I go to the concept of looking to something that had died, that or was abandoned or was let go of, that was that still had great value, and that that time and distance has created a new perspective, new people, a new mind, new tools, new ideas to bring something to life that kept the elements that were timeless and beautiful, but added to it in a new way that made it even more beautiful and then relevant to that current time. So maybe all I've done is define the word technically, but I think when you apply that to storytelling, I think we're constantly we're going through these phases of, action movies and Westerns back in the 60s and 70s. And, but then you look and you think, okay, what has happened in the last few years? And you look at something like La La Land. That was in itself a little miniature rebirth of the heyday of Hollywood musicals. And that's having ramifications in film and television. You're looking at these stories that are about overcoming obstacles, whether it's the rebirth of the A Star Is Born remake, or it's lots of other character-driven dramas that are about people that are overcoming, and they're inspiring stories. And so I think that we as people of faith have the opportunity to kind of ride this renaissance, this kind of rebirth of meaningful stories. We're able to kind of capture that and ride on that and bring our faith to bear. And, one of the things we have to remember is that the Bible is the number one greatest source of IP in the history of the world. It remains the best-selling book of all time every year in almost every country. And there are so many amazing stories in there that can be told in modern contemporary ways or in period ways, or, and so I think, we have an opportunity as creators of and tellers of stories to ride that growth and that change that's happening in the world in a way that glorifies God and allows us to refine our art.
That's beautiful. I love that. Rich Peluso, I've got to say thank you very much on behalf of all of the people watching this. We've really appreciated your time today. So God bless, and we look forward to watching the projects that you're working on and the future ones that will come. God bless.